Hey guys, today we're going to talk about how to get those big damage numbers that everyone sees. So this is going to be specifically for our Ice Shard Sorcerer here. So we're going to rely a lot on critical damage and vulnerable, but let's go ahead and see the damage numbers, see what we're dealing with. So we're going to walk in, so we pull them together, hit them with the vulnerable with the Frost Nova. You see some tiny 78, not very good, but when our Ice Shards fire off, right here, boom. Okay, so we have our white text here, see 51k, and then our yellow text, which is our critical strikes. So white is our normal attack, yellow is crit. You see we got some pretty big crits here, and everything's just exploding. So, gonna go to the next pack, dodge this guy, and let's see what happens. So we pull everybody in, stun them, hit them with vulnerable, and then let's look at our numbers. 1k, not great. Boom. Okay. So we have 150k as a crit, and our white numbers, they're still pretty decent. 27,000, not bad. But 193, this is pretty good numbers. Especially these guys are level like 92. This is tier 39, and they're just getting one shot. So it's pretty good damage, but the big question is, where does this all come from? So it comes from our critical strike damage and our vulnerable damage. So we have 158% critical strike damage, which is going to be bonus, and we have a 39.3% critical strike chance, which is pretty high. And our vulnerable damage is 175%. So as you can see here, it starts at 20. We've added 155 from our items in Paragon, and our critical strike starts at 50%, and we've added pretty much 100% from our stats in Paragon. These other numbers down here, damage versus elites, damage versus crowd controlled, all this stuff, all this damage width, all these get added together and then multiplied in. So even if you're, huge here, damage versus crowd controlled, it's still not as good as these separate multipliers here of vulnerable damage and critical strike. So this gets multiplied into your damage, this gets multiplied into your damage, and these get added together and multiplied. So having these is good, but it kind of falls off later in the game. So stacking vulnerable and crit strike is great. And where we're getting this is, so first off, our intelligence just gives increased skill damage by 85%. So having this on your gear, like my staff here has plus 183 intelligence, which is great. And you also see core skill damage and critical strike damage. So on this build, specifically Ice Shards, it's our only damaging spell. I mean, we have our ultimate, but this is the only other thing that causes damage. Everything else is defensive in nature. So, core skill damage, great, and critical strike damage is great. Our ring here, we have vulnerable damage, crit strike damage, crit strike chance. And on this other ring, it's the same thing. Vulnerable damage, crit strike chance, crit strike damage. And on our gloves, we have more crit strike chance. So on these pieces here, it's good to stack crit strike, crit damage. If I could, find a staff that's this good and it has something better than overpower damage, then that'd be fine. But that's really what you want to be looking out for. You can also get things like cooldown on your helmet and cooldown on your amulets. This gives plus intelligence and just plus 13% damage. So you can really help your numbers by an increase in percent damage and intelligence. Since intelligence gives us damage, it kind of stacks up. And cooldown reduction just helps your spells. We're playing around Frost Nova in this build, so even though it gets a 32% increase, still at 18 seconds, which is not great, but it's good. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the critical strike and the vulnerable on our gear. And in the Paragon, we have the control glyph, which is damage to crowd-controlled enemies. So when we jump in and stun and freeze them, it does more damage. And the bonus here, you deal increased damage to chilled and increased to stunned or frozen. So we're getting a 20% damage multiplier on those frozen guys. Which is very nice. And then here on the Frigid Fate board, we're getting 20% vulnerable damage, 20% vulnerable damage, 10, 10, and then another 10. So we're doing a lot of vulnerable damage with this Unleashed glyph on the Frigid Fate board. Then moving over to the Burning Instinct, we have the Exploit glyph, which is giving us even more vulnerable damage. Not really taking any of these nodes. I have this because it's level 13 at the moment, this glyph. When it gets to level 15, we'll be able to use this dex to get more vulnerable damage. And moving on to the Static Surge board, we have the Destruction glyph, which gives us critical strike damage with core skills. That every time our ice shards crit, it gets plus 73.2%, as you saw in that clip I played. The ice shards automatically fire whenever there's a frozen enemy, and then they just crit, and tons of damage. Everybody explodes. And finally, moving over to the Frostbites on the Icefall board, it gives damage to chilled enemies. I haven't really gotten to pump this up yet. I think this node is still level 1. So put some levels into it and it'll get a lot more powerful. And also grabbed the Icefall legendary node. So every time we kill one of those frozen enemies, we get a barrier. So it's pretty nice, pretty good setup. And again, just to emphasize, critical strike damage, vulnerable damage. That's where we're getting all our damage. Get it in your paragons, get it on your gear. Critical strike damage, vulnerable damage. Critical strike, vulnerable damage. And that's pretty much it. Thanks, guys.